Hi, welcome to Culture and Causation. I'm Aaron Briley. So, I recently read an article titled Woke Classrooms Show Why Us Parents Should Be Free to Choose on Schools. I'm excited to have the author, Kerry McDonald, with me today to discuss it. Kerry McDonald is a senior education fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education and author of Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom. She is also an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute and a regular Forbes contributor. So schooling options is a really hot topic, especially in light of the past year. And I definitely want to get into both what's happening with the curricula in our classrooms and what options parents have to fight back. So without further delay, Kerry, welcome to the show.
It's great to be with you, Aaron. Thanks for inviting me.
Great, thank you. So let's discuss your article titled Woke Classrooms Show Why Us Parents Should Be Free to Choose on Schools. So let me start off with a quote, I guess, and then I'll have you explain it. So this is from the article, quote, Illinois legislators last week, now this was in February this year, voted in favor of enacting new, quote, culturally responsive teaching and leading standards, unquote, in the state's teacher education programs. Beginning in October, all Illinois teacher training programs must start to reflect the new standards that focus on, quote unquote, systems of oppression, with teacher trainees required to understand that there are systems in our society that create and reinforce inequities, thereby creating oppressive conditions, unquote. So my question, I think, for most viewers who might not be familiar with this, what's happening here? What does this mean and what's going on in our classrooms?
Yeah, so I think the Illinois legislation that was passed for this teacher training curriculum is also reflective of sort of this larger push toward what's known as critical race theory in curriculum and pedagogy in a lot of states. We saw an ethnic studies curriculum passed in California this past year that also was contentious, and a lot of people were against that. And then in response, you've seen several states impose what they consider to be bans on critical race theory. So quite a bit of conflict around this topic. And in the article that you're talking about, with these sort of woke classrooms or this emphasis on critical race theory, which focuses on viewing all social interactions through the lens of race and racial identity, it's sort of rooted in Marxist ideology of oppressed versus oppressor, using the basis of race, whereas originally it would, with Marxism, would have been class, but that same sort of conflict doctrine as opposed to the harmony doctrine we think of with classical liberal values that focus on sort of individual versus group identity. So what's happening with the culturally relevant teaching and leading standards in Illinois, I think, is really fascinating, because right before the state legislature in February voted to pass these new standards, the Chicago Tribune editorial board, to its credit, came out and opposed this bill. They said that this is unnecessarily divisive, that it has in the language of the bill what we would consider to be progressive language, and that if the language had been on the other side with more of these kinds of conservative terms or terms and kind of educational philosophy we would associate with conservative or traditional values, that the progressives in the state would be up in arms. And they also, the editorial board also, I think, made a really important point. They said, and I can actually quote because I include this in the article, they said, quote, teachers could be evaluated on how sensitively they meet students' needs, how engaged they become in political causes, rather than how much their students understand basic reading, writing, and critical thinking. And I think that that is such a crucial point, because a lot of what's emphasized in these teaching and leading standards is this focus on essentially creating student activism, as opposed to really emphasizing critical thinking skills and basic literacy and numeracy and all the sort of skills and educational requirements we would see as necessary to be an educated American. So the editorial board put this out, and then 2 days later, the legislative committee approved the new standards. And as you mentioned, they go into effect in the teacher training programs this October. And of course, then very quickly become, sort of penetrating the classrooms throughout Illinois.
Now, what can parents say? I assume that there's opposition to this. Can parents fight back in any way? Are they just powerless to, as far as getting these things reversed?
Well, I mean, I think it's this larger discussion around critical race theory in the classroom overall. As I mentioned, that's what is sort of driving these bans on critical race theory in many states. One of the things that I have written about as I've been writing about critical race theory over the past several months is that it brings to light the divisiveness of public schooling, of government-run, government-funded public schooling, that it creates these battles. It creates this conflict because it is a battle of wills, right? It's one group with one worldview imposing its viewpoints on another group through sort of political force with these government schools. So, from a libertarian perspective, the ideal would be a fully privatized education system that allows for everyone to have as much choice in education as they do, for example, with where they buy groceries. And we don't have grocery stores assigned to us by the government according to our zip code. We have lots of choices where to go, and we also provide, resources to families that might not be able to afford food in the form of food stamps, where they can take money to whichever grocery store they choose, but it's not assigned to them. And that would be sort of the essence of school choice legislation and school choice policies that thankfully over the past year and a half have really gained tremendous support as a result of school shutdowns and COVID policy. But I think a big part of that also is this emphasis on sort of these curriculum wars in the public schools and feeling like parents need more options. So, one of the things that I've really pushed against is said, rather than states banning critical race theory, which I'm opposed to, or states like Illinois implementing critical race theory through these teaching and leading standards, which I would also be opposed to, the key would be to if the state legislature wants to do anything at all, which would be to enact school choice policies that enable families to take a portion of their tax dollars that are going to education funding and use that in the form of an education savings account or a voucher or a tax credit scholarship program to the school or learning program of their choice. And I make the point in several of my fee articles that no matter what policy you're enacting, whether you're in Illinois and you're a parent who's opposed to these teaching and leading standards in Illinois, or for example, you're in Idaho and you're opposed to a ban on critical race theory. Idaho was one of the first states this year to pass a ban on critical race theory that was also met with a lot of opposition from parents. In both of those cases, the parents who are opposing whatever curriculum is being pushed into their children's schools should have the opportunity of exit through these school choice policies.
And that's a great point. I want to segue into this because in the article you actually discuss, some of the effects of these policies, like some of the effects of teaching this very, far left wing ideology in the schools. And you're saying that parents from, middle class or well-to-do homes are actually taking their children out of schools and putting them elsewhere. But this option isn't necessarily open for parents with little sort of financial means to relocate their children. That is to say, to actually move to a different district or just to put their children in private schools.
Right.
So what options do parents have if they find out this is happening in their school? What can they do?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're right that privileged families or more affluent upper middle class families have school choice already, right? And they can decide where to live or which school their child attends to or get out of a mandatory school assignment because they have those opportunities. And in fact, we saw a lot of that happening over the course of the springtime, where we had parents at some of the most elite private schools in Manhattan that were pushing critical race theory and sort of racially divisive curriculum and ideology on children. The parents vocally stood up against that and pulled their kids from those schools for other options. But you're absolutely right that we need to provide that same opportunity of exit to families who don't have a lot of means to pay for an expensive private school. And that's where, again, these school choice policies are huge. We have school choice legislation in over 24 states that came up this past year. School choice support is the highest it's ever been. The most recent Real Clear Opinion research survey from this spring showed 74% of taxpayers now support school choice. Just record numbers of taxpayers realizing that families should have more ability to decide where and how and with whom their children are educated. And again, I think you see this kind of confluence of COVID policy in terms of its impact on schools and school shutdowns, along with some of these curriculum wars, sort of accelerating the support for school choice and really putting parents back in charge. One of the things I'll say is I have a new free ebook out at fee.org, the Foundation for Economic Education, called the 2021 Curious Parents Guide to Education Options. And it talks a lot about sort of this, the inclusion of critical race theory in classrooms that's frustrated a lot of parents and educators, as well as, again, these school shutdowns and related COVID policy that's also frustrated parents. And it's coming together to cause families to really look at what other education options they may have, regardless of what their state school choice policies may be. So certainly from a legislative or policy perspective, we'd want to be pushing for the expansion of school choice policies at the state level. But in the meantime, there are still other choices that families have that don't necessarily involve a hefty tuition at a different private school. So I talk about the skyrocketing rate of homeschooling, independent homeschooling that's occurred over the past year and a half. High quality virtual learning options. One of my real fears is that the fact that Zoom school through one's district has been a disaster for many kids over the past year and a half. I hope that that doesn't dissuade families from realizing there are some really high quality, low cost private online learning options that could be available to them. I talk about low cost private schools, micro school networks, learning pods. So there's quite a few other options I think that families may not realize are available to them that would enable them to exit an assigned district school for other learning possibilities.
And do you have any, I think this is really fantastic. I think many people don't realize that they have this many opportunities. And especially, I think a lot of people, myself included, really didn't realize that they have a lot of high quality, low cost options. So this is really encouraging. Do you have any data or do you have any sense of how well homeschool children do versus the traditional public schools?
Yeah, so I'll start with a little bit of data over the past year through the school shutdowns and how it's really driven a massive increase in the homeschool population. So the US Census Bureau came out with data in February 2021 showing a tripling of the homeschooling rate in the US from its pre-pandemic levels to now over 11% of all US K-12 students are being homeschooled. That's over 5.5 million kids. And interestingly, the US Census Bureau pointed out that the largest driver for this tremendous increase in homeschooling over the past year were Black homeschoolers that had a 5-fold increase from the spring of 2020 to the fall of 2020. And now the Black homeschoolers are actually overrepresented in the overall homeschool population compared to their representation in the K-12 public school population. So just sort of a fascinating drive towards independent homeschooling. And modern homeschooling, even pre-pandemic, was becoming increasingly reflective of the overall US school age population, and now even more so. So that's been exciting. Yes, in terms of academic outcomes, probably the most recent good data we have showing positive academic outcomes for homeschoolers comes through a literature review conducted by Dr. Lindsay Burke at the Heritage Foundation, where she looked at sort of this compilation of all different research studies on the academic outcomes of homeschoolers, finding overall positive outcomes there. And, not surprisingly, as we know in general with education, parental involvement, kind of family involvement in a child's education leads to good outcomes, positive academic outcomes. So it's not surprising we're seeing that, of course, with homeschooling as well. And I will also say that Daniel Hamlin, who's a professor at the University of Oklahoma, has also done some excellent work on homeschooling, focusing specifically on what he calls cultural capital, or sort of the social interactions that homeschoolers have because they're learning outside of a conventional classroom. And he finds that homeschoolers are much more likely than their schooled peers to go to the library, the bookstore, the zoo, cultural events, musical events, community programming, all kinds of these sort of resources that are around us. They're much more likely to do that, to be really immersed in their communities and have kind of that larger social perspective.
That seems counterintuitive. It's fascinating thing to say, because you think that taking children outside of school and outside of maybe their peer group, or just sort of these interpersonal interactions, would make them less kind of culturally or socially aware. But I can see how this could actually increase that. So that's a fascinating thing. And it kind of ties into my next question, which I can see a lot of the benefits. And I think you really laid out a lot of the benefits of doing a non-traditional sort of educational kind of routine for your child. But are there any kind of cons to this, or any negatives that you can think of, or can you think of any children, any types of children who might not be suited for this? Or do you think you can sort of find a non-traditional educational solution for everyone?
Yeah. So you said, that it sort of seems counterintuitive, this research on the social interactions of homeschoolers. And I just say that, if you look into it a little bit more, I would argue that what's really fabricated or inauthentic are the kinds of schooling environments that most children are in. They're in these sort of age segregated classrooms with the same group of students and a static handful of teachers going to the same building, typically a government building, every day, with a standardized curriculum and testing approach. And, that is really not at all reflective of sort of the real world. And if anything, homeschoolers are much more authentically, genuinely immersed in the people, places, and things around them, as Professor Hamlin's research shows. So no, I don't think that there is a con to it. I think actually this is the wave of the future. I think this is the path towards education, is moving away from sort of this 19th century model of industrial schooling towards an educational paradigm that's much more appropriate for the realities of the 21st century and the innovation era. And that would involve much more freedom and flexibility in learning. It would involve using these tremendous digital resources at our fingertips, tapping into mentors and top-notch educators from around the country or around the world. And forming these, for sort of voluntary association communities, like these pandemic pods or learning pods that we've seen sprout over the past year and a half, where families get together and either pool their resources to hire an educator to facilitate a curriculum or lead a group, or parents themselves take turns doing that in different homes. This was sort of the kind of pandemic twist on the microschool movement that had been gaining traction prior to the pandemic, where you had these growing microschool networks. I think of Prenda out of Arizona, now expanded to other states, and the Acton Academy model of microschools that has been nationwide. They are these sort of in-home, multi-age, educator-led, sort of one-room schoolhouse types of models, but that are much more personalized and geared towards academic achievement at the individual level.
And so I guess I want to wrap up with maybe two questions. And just to follow up on that one, Are there any resources where parents can go to get more information on this kind of pod schooling and everything else that you mentioned? Can they find that in your online ebook, or should they go elsewhere? Where can
Yeah, for sure. Yes, please go download my free ebook. You can also see all of my other resources at fee.org/Kerry, Kerry. But the other thing that I would suggest, and often what I suggest for families that are considering homeschooling or considering some alternative to their district school, is to connect with their local community. And so one of the things, the first steps to do perhaps is to go to a local Facebook group or groups or a similar social network in one's local area and find out, what is available, what are some of the opportunities. And I think that families will be really surprised at how, robust an education they can provide for their children using these community resources, using libraries, museums, local organizations, and businesses that cater to homeschoolers, particularly now that homeschoolers are such a such a sort of a market block. There's real opportunity for daytime programming, and entrepreneurs are stepping up to meet that demand with some tremendous programs, as well as I mentioned, online resources. So that's where I would start, is connect locally, but also, for sure, visit my website at FEE.
Great. And just to circle back around, to see if there's any light at the end of the tunnel, do you see critical race theory as it's taught now, as it's being pushed in the traditional classrooms? Do you see that trend dying anytime soon or being reversed nationwide?
I think we're going to still have these conflicts because, as I mentioned before, it is government schooling. It's inherently divisive. You saw recently a battle at a school board meeting in Virginia end with 2 people being arrested over these battles. And it's again because it's pushing one political will onto another political will in the form of government schooling. So the answer really is to encourage privatization and choice for families, and then you'll avoid that conflict because everyone will decide, what they want to do. And one of the points that I make in my article, in particular, about this Virginia school board meeting that became heated, is, again, if we had government assigned grocery stores and we were all arguing over what was on the shelves, you can imagine there would be similar conflict over, do we stock Wheaties or Raisin Bran, and how much and for whom? It would create that same battle of wills because it's not allowing for choice. It's rooted in government coercion. And so the answer really is this robust free market of choices in education. And I think that's where entrepreneurship will step in. We've already, I think, seeing this demand for parents for education that's not rooted in ideology, that maybe just focuses on the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic. And I think there'll be more of that. There'll be more educational entrepreneurs that will step up to fill that demand and provide that kinds of curriculum and learning opportunities for children.
I think that's a really good point, just to highlight that fact that, just by the nature of having these government schools, it's inherent in this that there are going to be these battles because, they're going to push a certain type of curriculum, and it's just inherent in the nature of really not having the choice, having this monopoly over, or this, it's not so much anymore, but for a long time there was this monopoly over how we're going to teach our children through this public school system. So I think, that's something that people really need to consider, that whether it's over critical race theory being taught or something else, these battles, I think, are inherent in the structure of this limited choice of a government-run school. So that's
and one of the points that I made in one of my articles is, this is nothing new. I mean, critical race theory happens to be the curriculum debate of the day, but we had the same conflict over prayer in school or any other, curriculum battles that would have really ripped communities apart or pitted, parents against parents because of, again, that kind of an inherently coercive model of government schooling.
Great. Now, we're sort of closing out on time here, but would you like to add any closing remarks or mention anything that's been left out, or do you think we've done a pretty good job with the time we had?
Yeah, I would just say that, I think I mentioned this skyrocketing rate of independent homeschooling over the last year and a half. I think that with back to school season being as uncertain and unsettled this fall as it was last fall, we'll continue to see parents opt out of schools for other options, in large part due to current debates over should there be masks in schools, should there not be masks in schools, should there be, entire classrooms quarantined, which we're already seeing happen in the areas that have opened school already this year. So there's a lot of unpredictability. I think parents are going to want something that's calmer, more settled for their kids over the coming year. So we'll continue to see that opt out, as well as these ongoing curriculum debates. So I think it's a great time to be an education entrepreneur, and I'm really hopeful for the future of education innovation to expand the learning solutions and learning possibilities for families.
I'm excited about that also. And last but not least, where can people find you or your work online, Kerry?
Yeah, so you can visit me at fee.org/Kerry. There you'll see links to all of my social media accounts, and go ahead and send me an email.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kerry, for taking the time to talk with me today. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, thanks again, Aaron.